All right, so today's agenda, I know that the topic is 5 ways to help guarantee a lease. I have 5 and then some others as well, but I think the easiest way to break it down is what can you do when you're pre-screening a tenant to select a tenant that is going to be likely to actually go through with the lease negotiation, what can you do to make your lease stronger, and post-lease signing. So once they move in, what are some of the things that you can do to make sure that they stay on that lease and they keep paying the lease and that they don't break it. And then at the end, like I said, we'll go over the Q&A. So real quick, when do good tenants turn bad? So I know that a lot of you guys use our services for screening, and you might be thinking, okay, I screened the tenant. I found that they have good credit, and I verified their income, and for some reason, they still didn't end up paying the rent. How did that even happen? Or maybe you screen them and you see that they don't have any evictions and they have okay credit and you decide to give them a chance. So what happens? Well, a lot of times there are a few things that tenants do to hide from you really what their true situation is. And I'll go over some of the things that they do. I think this is a good way to introduce the whole topic just because knowing these things can help you look out for or recognize that you do have to put some other things in place to make your lease a little bit stronger, even when you do your homework. So number 1, 3-day notices and late payments aren't public record. So a lot of people think that just because a notice is served to a tenant or a tenant pays late, that this gets recorded in some big nationwide database or a court database, and it just does not. There's really no way to know this without actually contacting the previous landlord and asking them if they've paid their rent on time. And even then, you might not be able to trust what the landlord says. But really, this is key. You might not have all the information that you need, even though you are screening a tenant. Number 2, most landlords don't bother taking a tenant to court. You may have encountered this situation yourself. If you have a bad tenant and you know that they don't have money to pay you, why would you take them to court? Why bother? So a lot of landlords don't even go through that extra step. Unfortunately, when that happens, nobody knows it happened. So if it's not recorded in the court, then as a landlord, you're left with less information. Number 3, they got evicted, but it hasn't been recorded yet. So as you guys know, the court process is pretty slow. There is definitely a time frame where an eviction could have already occurred, but has not been recorded in the court. And that's exactly when tenants are going to be extremely rushed to try to find a new place. So before that eviction gets recorded, they are in a hurry. And that's something you should look out for. Definitely a warning sign when somebody is extremely ready to get into your rental to the point where it's a little fishy. Number 4 is they go by different alias names. So this is something we see here through the screening where we will find out somebody's been using 3 or 4 names, and maybe they're not completely different, they're just a little off. Unfortunately, if something's been recorded in a separate name, it can make it more difficult to find, although we can find some alias names. However, it just makes it that much harder to go through. So bottom line, a first impression and screening sometimes is not enough. So I'm still going to go through what are some things you can do to make it more likely that people, get the truth and that people are actually going to follow through. But unfortunately, that's the reality. So 7 reasons a tenant might not pay you. So like I said earlier, it's not really always a bad intention. Sometimes it can be a medical reason. For example, I just had actually one of our AAOA members tell us that one of their tenants had eye surgery and had to break their lease early because they couldn't afford all the medical bills. Very sad situation, but it does happen. Unemployment as well. Sometimes you don't know what somebody's employment is going to be. Even though you verified their income up front, things could change later in the future. 3, they break a lease early. Maybe they have to move because of a new job relocation, or maybe they have to take care of a family member who's now ill. That's also another common reason. Irresponsibility. So this means maybe they just didn't want to pay their bills on time because they spent their money on something they shouldn't have. And that's obviously very common. Bankruptcy goes along with irresponsibility. So now you have a bankruptcy and you might not even be able to get the money from the tenant for the rent that they owe you. Or there's a co-tenant. Roommate situation, boyfriend, girlfriend. It happens all the time. One of them stops paying, the other one can't afford it. So now they have to leave and break the lease early because they probably won't be able to find somebody else to fill the space quick enough. Or they can't afford damages. So maybe their property is extremely damaged and the security deposit just doesn't cover it. So, and they don't have the money to pay for it either. So then you're left with damages that you need to pay for. All right, so what can we do? Let's start with pre-screening. So obviously this is one of the key components when finding a good tenant to rent to. And most of you have probably used our tenant screening, so I'm going to keep this part brief. But there are a few things that I want to point out that can make your screening even stronger, which will ultimately help you guarantee your lease. So, number one, tenant screening. Set criteria. Set criteria. What do I mean by that? Tell tenants what you're looking for before they even apply. So unfortunately, there are some situations where landlords or managers may want to be a little bit more lenient with their set criteria, or they just don't have any criteria at all. So they're just using their gut and they just wait for, maybe they get a tenant screening report, and then if it looks okay, they might make their decision based on that, but they don't really have a guide to go off of. So this makes it really easy for them to fall victim to any prospective tenant story. So you start to feel bad, or maybe you make a decision that you shouldn't and you kind of bend your rules a little bit. That's something that definitely will increase the likelihood that you're going to get somebody who's not going to follow through on your lease. So I'm going to talk about how you can be flexible with your criteria in a safer way and still protect your lease later on in the webinar. But regardless, you should have set criteria to begin with. So finding qualified applicants is the first step. Disclose your criteria up front. Here are some examples of criteria that you might want to consider. Credit score. So I know that on our credit scoring system, we use different colors. So we have the yellow, green, orange, red. On every credit report, you might say, I only want people in the green, or I only want people in the yellow and green, or I don't accept red. It's definitely something that you could implement. Two is collections. Normally, people don't take into consideration medical. As we mentioned before, that's pretty unfortunate, and I know some people can't pay their bills. So when we talk about collections, I mean things for like utility bills, or especially collections to an apartment building if they owe them money. That's going to be a huge red flag, and maybe you might want to implement something about how many collections or what type of collections are okay to have on a credit report. Evictions, obviously, this could be a no-go, just automatically decline for a lot of landlords. Or maybe you might say that there's a time frame in which the evictions are okay. Maybe they have recovered since they had the eviction, especially if it was 5 or 6 years ago. Number four, bankruptcies. The only thing that's good with the bankruptcies is, obviously they don't have as many liabilities after that happens, but that's also something that you may want to consider avoiding. And income to rent ratio, which is extremely important. So this has to do with the affordability. So if their income is coming in and it's not enough to cover the rent, we usually recommend a 3 to 1. Some landlords do 2.5 to 1, but they should be making at least 2.5 times of whatever your rent costs. Not to mention, you should also look at the credit report and see how much debt they have, because they might have a car payment to pay, or maybe a loan, student loan they have to pay every month. A lot of credit card debt possibly. So if you factor that in with how much they make, can they actually afford your rent comfortably? Do they have enough of a safety net there? If something were to happen, would they be able to keep paying, or are they super tight living paycheck to paycheck every month if they were to rent your rental? So that's going to be huge for whether or not they're going to be able to afford the lease, or if they break the lease early later if something happens. So income to rent ratio, highly recommend doing it whenever. However, notice here I don't mention criminal. The reason why I didn't is because lately there's a lot of legislation about blanket rules on criminal records. So I wouldn't want you to say that anybody with a criminal record can't actually apply or won't be accepted, because that is definitely a fair housing issue. So I wouldn't recommend including that in any of your criteria. Stick to just financial. And also just one more thing for income, that I'm referring to any income. So you don't discriminate based on income. It could be from child support, it could be from disability or unemployment even, but it should add up to the 2.5 times the rent. at least. All right, so number one still, tenant screening, credit and background check. I have some landlords who they'll do the red package, and that's fine. But the red package doesn't have criminal history, so I think that's, even though it wasn't a factor in the criteria before, I still think that's something worth considering, obviously for safety reasons, or if the person has a history of theft or forgery, that kind of thing, you might want to know, right? So I would recommend starting at least the white package, but the blue or the gold would be even better because that has nationwide criminal, and the gold has nationwide eviction records. So now you're getting, basically everything there is out there about that person and their background, so you can make a more informed decision. All right, documentation. So this makes it not only easier to make a decision to rent to somebody, but later, if the person doesn't actually end up paying the rent, it makes it way easier to find them and or to collect the debts that they owe you. And so even though we can't guarantee that the person is going to go through and follow through with the lease, at least you can increase your chances of collecting that money if you did your homework upfront. This is something where landlords learn later that it's too late. They don't have the person's social, they don't have their real name, they don't have any references, they don't know where they work, they don't know where they bank. So what does that do? Well, it makes it really difficult for you to collect anything. First one, use AAOA's free rental application. This is one of the handouts that I actually put over on your screen, and I actually put here the comprehensive version. We have two versions. Personally, comprehensive is the way to go. The one that is shorter is nicer because, okay, the person doesn't feel like you're asking them a million questions, but I have to say, from what I've seen, the information that's collected on the comprehensive goes much more into depth for references and finances than the regular one, and that's information that you may want to have later. The more information you have, the better it is later if you need to use it. Hopefully you won't, and I know you want to think that the person that's applying is a good person and that you don't need to collect that much information from them because you feel like you can trust them, but you really don't know them, and you really don't know what may happen later. So it's important to have as much information as possible and make sure that if you do collect that information, it's the same amount of information collected for every applicant. So don't cherry pick, obviously, if you think somebody's suspicious or something and ask them more than somebody else, but make sure that you do have a good, solid rental application, that you keep copies of that, and that you verify some other items like paycheck stubs. So where do they work? This later in the future for collection purposes would help with wage garnishment, for example. Also, too, it shows that they have steady income. Obviously, we talked about the income to rent ratio, so you can use that for that. I would also call the employer just to double check the status of the employment because it could be an old paycheck stub and maybe they just got laid off. You want to make sure they actually work there and that they have good standing. 3 is references. So this would be landlord references, I would say, more than anything, that would basically show that they've been paying their rent on time. Also a good idea to have that. And also with references, having family member names and other names of people that they know, like emergency contacts, because those are people who later might be able to help you track down the tenant. Copy of ID. This one is really obvious, but I actually did a survey recently, and our AAOA members, a lot of them are not collecting ID. And when I'm talking about ID, I mean government issued. So driver's license, social security number, passport, what have you. The reason why this is important is because not only will it verify the person is real and that they are who they say they are, so now you know that the background check is actually valid, but later, if you did have to track them down, you actually know who you're tracking down. Imagine if they gave you a completely different identity, or if they used their father's social. So we see that a lot, seniors and juniors, where they're trying to maybe get in by using their father's background or credit. So make sure that you have a copy of that ID and you keep that on file. Okay, so next part, lease negotiation. So now at this point, they've applied, they've qualified, you're ready to start signing. But there are a couple things that you should know about first before you do that. you could still run into an unexpected bad apple. So you might want to actually set some additional conditions on the lease that will make it even stronger. And even if somebody does qualify and they seem like they would be a great tenant, you may still want to consider adding some additional conditions to it. So I'm going to go over the different conditions. The first one is lease guarantee. Lease guarantee is fairly new, so I'm going to still go through it in pretty much a lot of detail here, because it's something that a lot of landlords aren't familiar with yet, because it is a new form of protection that you can actually get for your lease. So what is it? Lease guarantee basically reimburses you for court judgments related to the lease. So why is this so important? So most of the time, your security deposit isn't going to cover your losses. You guys may have found that out already. So you would be out of pocket unless you take the tenant to court. Or they might not have paid you because they just can't afford it. And then you still have to take them to court to get anything back. And unfortunately, quick facts, 80% of judgments are never collected. So getting the judgment might not even be that hard. It's pretty easy to prove that somebody hasn't paid you rent, and it's pretty easy to show how much they owe you. Sometimes damages can be a little subjective if you don't have receipts, but most of the time you can get a judgment. I mean, you're in the right as a landlord, but 80% of judgments are never collected. So even if you get the judgment, yes, it goes on the person's record, but you don't have any more money because of it. In fact, you probably have less money because now you've probably paid legal fees or filing fees just to do that, and now you have money that's outstanding from the tenant. They might not be able to afford it because that's probably the reason why they stopped paying you rent, was they just didn't have the money. And most of the time they won't. You will have a certain amount of time to collect on that monetary judgment. In some states it's a few years, in others it can be longer, but still, you could also hire a collection agency, but collection agencies have under 17% success rate. So now you're hoping that another party that you're paying can maybe collect money from a tenant who doesn't have it. It just doesn't make any sense, right? So for lease guarantee, at least if you have that, you know that you don't have to deal with this collection agency thing. You don't have to deal with going to court and not getting any money back. You will be guaranteed the money up to whatever lease guarantee amount you purchased. And so it's either you purchase the lease guarantee or you require the tenant to purchase it. This comes into play during the lease negotiation because in addition to a security deposit, you could ask them to get the lease guarantee. And this really just makes it go so much further. You have your security deposit, you can use that for repairs and damages. But if you have to take them to court, it's most likely going to be more than your security deposit, which means that you're going to be out of pocket to do that. And so with the lease guarantee, you wouldn't be. As soon as you get the judgment, you get reimbursed, and you can use a security deposit however you'd like for any repairs or damages. All right, I do want to do a quick comparison because I get this question a lot, is how is lease guarantee different than renter's insurance? And it is quite different. Renter's insurance is still something that you may want to consider getting as well, but I'll describe the differences. So lease guarantee is intentional. So these are going to be damages that they made intentionally to the unit, or let's say they stopped paying rent, right? That's sort of intentional. Renter's insurance is for accidental stuff. So we're talking about floods, theft, things that happen that are outside of the tenant's control. Lease guarantee, no deductible, so the reimbursement is given to you right away. You don't actually have to pay more than what the lease guarantee costs. Renter's insurance obviously has deductibles. So even though the renter might be paying, it's usually $10 to $20 a month, they would still need to pay an additional amount of money just to use the insurance policy. So sometimes it's not even worth it. A lease guarantee is paid upfront for the 12 months, and renter's insurance is paid monthly. And a lease guarantee can supplement a deposit, as I mentioned earlier, whereas renter's insurance can cover liability for you, whereas if somebody were to fall in your rental or something like that and they sued you, some renter's insurance can cover you for that. So that's the difference there. Lease guarantee activation. So I just want to talk about if you did want to get lease guarantee, how you would do it. First part is you have to order an AAA screening package to see if they qualify. So not everybody qualifies for lease guarantee, although most tenants do. They basically have to have a valid social that matches their name. That's important. And then there's a bunch of criteria and an algorithm that determines their eligibility based on their credit history. So just because they qualify, don't think that that means they're a great tenant. That means they just met the bare minimum requirements to get the lease guarantee. So I want to show you what that looks like. I'm going to exit out of here real quick and switch over to a sample profile. So you guys have probably seen this before. This here is the lease guarantee analyzer. It shows up on every report that you order if it's a red, white, blue, or gold package. If you do want to get lease guarantee, you click Get Lease Guarantee here, and it takes you over to the tenant's pricing. Okay, so these here are the base prices. What I usually recommend is 2 months of rent, I would say at least, just in case, because usually an eviction will be about that much or maybe even a little bit more. You can bill your tenant for it if you do want to work it into your lease and say that this is a requirement of the signing the lease, or you can pay for it yourself if that's something that you want to do to get a little bit of extra protection on the lease agreement. All right, so coming over here, from here, all right. So again, this is for new tenants, and you only need one lease guarantee for a lease agreement. So even if you have co-tenants or co-signers, you can still get the lease guarantee, and it would cover everybody on that lease. And there's a 10-day offer expiration, but if you do need more time, let us know, because I know the lease negotiation can, sometimes be unexpectedly longer than we'd like. So if you do need more time, let us know, and we'll extend that for you. All right. So the options, again, for the tenant to pay in addition to the security deposit, maybe instead of a cosigner if they don't have one. We've seen people reduce the security deposit, and that leaves the tenant more money to spend on other things, and you get more protection because now you have the lease guarantee, which actually protects you for thousands of dollars in case of a judgment. And then also, landlord pay. We've had landlords who just charge their tenants monthly if it's a lot for them to pay up front, or they might just use it as an investment in their own property. It's risk management. Okay, so benefits: protecting your rental income, you're filling a vacancy much faster, and you're helping tenants qualify, because sometimes you might get somebody who's not completely qualified. So I did talk about this earlier. You might be tempted to be flexible, and I just don't recommend that unless you have an additional condition like lease guarantee. Once you have an additional condition, that might actually make it way less risky to the point where you're willing to rent to them. They're happy because they qualify, and they may not be qualifying for other rentals like yours in the area. So this might be a way for them to recover. It's a great thing for them. It's good for you too, because now you filled a vacancy and you have a much lower risk because now you have the lease guarantee. And ultimately, peace of mind is really one of the biggest benefits, I think. Number 3 is the next tactic here, cosigner. So you guys are all probably familiar with cosigners, but I did want to point out a couple of things. First of all, why even get a cosigner? Well, the more responsible parties you have, the more likely it is you're going to get paid. You are basically shifting the responsibility to the cosigner if the applicant or co-tenants can't pay or qualify on their own. And so it's really important that you screen the co-signers when you get them. So obviously, if the tenant doesn't qualify, but the co-signer has great credit, you know that they're probably going to be less likely to default on the agreement because they don't want to ruin their credit. Make sure that you list the co-signers on the lease and any notices that you give out. So don't forget them after you've put them on there. Having them on all of this on any agreement really is going to be crucial for later if the agreement is broken. Also, make sure to include a clause like this one, which states Cosigner appoints tenant as his or her agent for service of process in the event of any lawsuit arising out of this agreement. So here, this clause is important because it means that if you sue the cosigner, you won't have to serve that cosigner personally with notification of your lawsuit. You can just serve the tenant, who is likely much easier to get a hold of. So don't forget to put that in there. It's definitely going to make it easier for you to hold the cosigner liable later if you have to. All right. A little out of order. Sorry about that. So another advantage here is that in some states you can go directly to the cosigner without dipping into the tenant's security deposit. That's also a huge advantage because then you could use a security deposit for repairs or damages instead of any non-payment of rent. And then also make sure that the cosigner signs any renewals or revised leases. Otherwise, they're not going to be held liable if the prior agreement has expired and you don't get the cosigner's agreement or the cosigner to sign the lease again, then it's not going to be valid anymore. So don't forget that. And lastly, you can still combine it with LeaseGuarantee. So I mentioned earlier that there are some tenants that don't qualify for LeaseGuarantee. But if you can find a cosigner that qualifies for LeaseGuarantee and they're both listed on the lease, you can still get LeaseGuarantee to cover that lease agreement. So now, not only do you have the cosigner who's held liable, but you also have the LeaseGuarantee. If you do have to take either the cosigner or the tenant to court, then you can also get reimbursement for the judgment plus the security deposit. So now we have a really strong likelihood of getting the money that's owed to us. There's more people liable that you can go after, and you have reimbursement option for any court judgments. So that's a fantastic combination. Number 4 is extra security deposit. So some of you on the call might be actually collecting maybe 1 month of security deposit. We also have, people who do 2 months. I've heard of some that even do more than that if it's allowed in the state. But really what you should think about is, first of all, there are limits in some states. So I know here in California, we can only do 2 months maximum. So it's really important that you are sticking within the legal limits of how much security deposit you can collect. Okay, the second thing, some tenants simply can't afford it. So there are actually problems with having too much security deposit. You might be actually turning away maybe some qualified tenants who just don't have thousands and thousands of dollars to put up front. Depending on your rental market, it might be actually very difficult to come up with that much security deposit. I know here in California, in Los Angeles, where I'm at, average rent for a 2-bedroom condo is going to be close to $2,000 a month. So if you ask for a 2-month security deposit, it's $4,000, and that's quite a lot for some people. So be aware of what the market can bear in as well, and also obviously the legal limit. Even if you do get extra security deposit though, it may still not be enough to cover your losses. I would suggest going up to the max that's possible or reasonable in your state, but be aware that damages add up very quickly, and legal costs and unpaid rent on top of that, usually landlords are going to run out of the security deposit. So it's helpful to a certain degree, and you should be doing it, but I would still combine it with something else, especially if the tenant isn't exactly qualified to or as qualified for the rental. The other thing I want to mention here is the liquidated damages clauses. So something really quick here to be aware of. This might actually be enforceable in some states. So what is this? Basically, it's when you put a set fee in your lease agreement for breaking the lease early. So you might have an agreement that says, okay, tenant, if you break your lease early, you have to pay me $3,000 or $4,000. Just know that that's not exactly legal in some states. So it's not that it's not legal, it's just not enforceable. And so you might actually be putting something in there that doesn't protect you as much as you think it might. So I would definitely look into whether or not you can include that clause in your agreement if you can. It's not a bad idea to do, just because that might give you some more ground to get money back for money that is left owed to you, basically because the lease was broken early and maybe you had a vacancy for a couple months. And even then, though, you might still have to take them to court for it, but at least then you would have some documentation. But I wouldn't recommend it if it's not enforceable in your state. And whether you, if you want to know whether or not you can do that, and how much security deposit you can set, and what are the rules with storing the security deposit? That's a common question too. A lot of states require you to put it into a separate trust account, and you have to pay interest on it. And so you don't want to break any of those rules, because then the tenant might be entitled to some of that security deposit. So what I would do is go over here to this link. It's landlord-tenant laws. So I'll show you exactly how to get to it. It's on our website here. If you go under education and you click on landlord-tenant laws, you're going to get a map of basically the whole U.S. If you click on your state, it gives you some of the basic guidelines regarding things like security deposits and cosigners and all that. So after the webinar, I would definitely recommend that you come on to here and take a quick look at some of those regulations. Oops, let me go back here. Sorry about that. It's not coming through. Let's see. There it goes. All right, let's get back to where we started, or where we left off. So post-lease signing. Okay, so now this is the last part here. You sign the lease, and hopefully you've incorporated some of those tactics that I mentioned earlier during your lease negotiation. So what can you ensure next to see that the lease won't be broken later? There are a few things I'm going to go over. So I kind of cheated and I made this number 5, but it's really multiple things in number 5. But I think they're all good tips. And some of you guys might be already doing this, but I do want to review it anyway. This can really help. The first one is give your tenants a separate handbook. So I know that you have a lease agreement and it says everything the tenant needs to know. Hopefully it's not too complex and full of legal jargon, but even if it is, even if it isn't, it's still difficult for tenants to know exactly what they should be doing. And sometimes just having an extra handbook that makes it really clear and in just common terms what the do's and don'ts are for the rental is going to be really helpful. And whether or not they follow it, that's up to them. But having an actual document that's easy to read really gives them no excuse to say, oh, I didn't know. They're actually given something that is easy for them to read, they're required to read, and that would spell everything out, all of your policies. So that's number 1, because if they know the policies, they're more likely to stick to them. Number 2, enforce the late policies quickly. So, for example, reporting any late payments to a collection agency early on. You don't have to take a tenant to court in most cases to report a tenant to the 3 major credit bureaus. If they know that that's part of your policy, they might be less likely to actually default or be late because they know that it's potentially something that could affect their credit. The longer you wait, though, to enforce these late payment policies, the less likely you'll be to collect or to get the money that's owed to you. So make sure that you're enforcing it quickly, and that if you do have to go in through an eviction process, that's done by the book on the day of. You don't want to have tenants who think that they can get away with drawing things out and changing your mind, and they promise you things that they don't come through with later. Maybe it's not their fault. I mean, we talked about the reasons why people go through this. It might be a hard time for them, but just regardless of the situation, you should have a very consistent late payment policy that will, go into effect as soon as it happens. Number 3, 2 to 4 inspections a year. 4 is a lot, but the point of having these inspections is, 1, find out if you have unauthorized tenants living in there, what's the condition of the rental, what are the maintenance issues that need to be addressed. Unfortunately, some landlords, they wait until move out, and by that time it's too late. So if you have so many issues that you can't afford to have the security deposit cover it, at that point you know that there are some things you should be doing to prepare yourself for the move out. And telling tenants about this policy verbally in your lease, in your handbook, that's something that's going to hold them accountable too, because they know that they might be checked up on and that they're going to be more likely to keep the rental decent. And then if you do an inspection, make sure that you document the results of every inspection and that you're giving them the proper notice. So in most states, it's a 24-hour written notice. In others, it might be a little longer, depending on the situation. So make sure you look that up and find out and set that into your lease. Number 4 is online rent payment and payment reporting. So the reason why this is actually really nice is, number 1, online rent payments can be done automatically on an automatic withdrawal. So if the money is automatically coming out of the tenant's account, it's more likely to be paid to you on time. Obviously, they're not going to be, forgetting that they have to pay. So it's not a guarantee, obviously, because they could stop that at any time if they want, but at least it does make it more likely that you're going to get that rent check on time. The second part to that is the payment reporting. So there's actually a company now, there's a couple of them, that do payment reporting for you. So if you would like, I can send you a link after the webinar with one of the companies that I know of that does this. They basically can help your tenant build credit because you can create a line, like an account in their credit report for their rent. And so once that account is created and it starts showing up on their credit report, and then if they don't pay and they do have a 30 or 60-day late payment, it does go on their credit report immediately. And that gets reported right away. You don't need to use a collection agency or anything like that. It'll just be automatically reported. And the reason why that's so great is because if a tenant knows that their non-payment or late payment even is going to be reported and affect their credit score, they're probably going to make sure that they are paying on time. The other thing that's important too is if they know that it's going to help their credit score, they'll also be incentivized to pay on time. So one of the great things about that is having an extra line of credit basically showing up on your credit report helps as long as you're paying it on time. The more credit history you have, the higher your score can be if you pay that on time. So it's a great thing to offer to them. And there is a small fee for it that you could charge the tenant for, but honestly, it's just a few dollars. So I'll send you the information after the webinar. Definitely something to look into. And number 5, which is also extremely important, is to rescreen for renewals. So a lot of things can change in a year. And usually tenants will default during the first 6 months or so of the lease. But that's not to say that you can't have issues later when the lease renews. So one of the things you might want to do is consider doing another screening. So that would be another credit check, background. You might want to know if they've had any criminal issues just before you do go ahead and sign that lease renewal. So it's sometimes better to just also have them it's better to have them also give you any additional proposed occupants at that point. So if they have actually moved in some people and you found out maybe during your inspection that they had more occupants than were listed on the lease, at the renewal, that would be the point where you can actually screen those tenants and you can have them sign a lease and make it official. So sometimes it's better to actually allow it, but to document it than to just say they have to move out. So working with the tenant on that is really important, and then also just making sure that they're still able to renew. And then if they do check off all the boxes and they can actually still afford the rental, and maybe they have some new occupants, but they're on the lease too, and those people have been screened as well, then that's fine.